Hello, everybody. Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Juan Espinosa, Director of Student Success here at the UCLA School of Nursing, and we're very excited to be kicking off our Faculty Spotlight lecture today with Dr. Jaime-Lara. Um, for the introduction, let me just pull this up here real quick. There we go. Rosario Jaime-Lara is a nurse researcher. Her research focuses on studying nutrition and health disparities in Latin American communities, as well as studying the underlying mechanisms associated with eating behavior in the context of obesity and health. Before coming to UCLA, Dr. Jaime-Lara completed a research fellowship at the National Institutes of Health, NIH. She received her BS in biology with an emphasis in neurobiology, physiology, and behavior from the University of California, Davis. She then entered a nursing program and completed a BS and MS in nursing at Columbia University. She worked as a public health nurse, helping transition acute care patients, including patients suffering from obesity-related complications and comorbid conditions, from a hospital to a community setting. She received her PhD from the University of Pennsylvania School of Nursing. Alrighty, take it away, Dr. Jaime Lara.
Hi everybody. It's so great to be here and get to share a little bit about my research and my experience. I wanted to kind of just start up by I'll kind of give a little bit of time for introductions. So I know there's like a couple people on the call and then some people here. So I would love to hear about where you are in your training. So a little bit of introductions and then I'll go ahead and introduce myself after that. But before I begin, I kind of wanted to talk a little bit about my little lab logo here, which is pretty new and I kind of developed. But I think it's a pretty good summary of what my research focuses on. So this kind of trifecta of understanding the metabolic health, food and eating behaviors, and then in Latin American communities. So I feel like each of the kind of pieces of those three symbols are very important for my research. And so I just wanted to give a little brief mention of that. And with that, yeah, we could go, if we could go around the room and introduce ourselves, that would be great. So
I'll start, guys. I'm Gabby. I'm in the APRN program. I'm a second year student and sorry, what was the other question?
yeah, just like, yeah, what your name is, what you're studying. Is there any particular interest or
Well, the reason why I came to this lecture series was because I read the intro and it showed like you were doing like obesity research and like I encounter so many patients in clinic because I'm at a FQHC and they're all like obese, like BMIs of like 60, 40. And like even if they go on weight loss meds, like the behavior aspect doesn't get taken care of. So they're not losing weight sometimes, or they're having like a lot of side effects from the medications of weight loss because of like their effects and like they keep eating. So they're having like reflux, throwing up, nausea and everything. And I'm like trying to explain things, but it's like behavior related to like previous like years of eating compulsively.
Right. And I think that's a great point. A lot of it is, there's like what makes it really hard for us in understanding and managing health of patients living with obesity is that it's not just one thing, it's a conglomeration of things. It is genetic predisposition, which is a huge factor. You could have two people that, look very, very different eating the same thing, right? And it's just some people have more predisposition to obesity and some don't. And then can on top of that, you have, how were people raised? What were they, what were they used to eating? What are those cultural foods? And we can't just tell people don't eat, things that are important for your cultural identity, but rather how do we adapt it in a way that's health, that promotes health without taking away joy or that element of people's identity. So it is definitely very hard, that weird kind of mixture of genetics, behavior, and environment, right? Because I think the other big piece that we often forget to talk about is that a lot of it is the systemic kind of systems that are in place that often disadvantage those minority communities, especially with less resources, right? So if you live in a food desert, how are you expected to, to buy that, like, or, buy, first of all, vegetables, but let alone like the kale and the other things that, people talk about. So, yeah, so thank you for sharing that. And I see, I think on Zoom, I see, if we could go around the room, I see Elizabeth. If you can introduce yourself.
Hi, I am a second year PhD student, and my research is on systemic drivers of nurse burnout, especially among minoritized nurses. But before I was a nurse, I was actually a cook, and I did a lot of stuff in like local food. So I've always been really interested in sort of food as medicine, even though that's not what I'm studying. And my my overall like larger research interests are really about health disparities. So I'm excited to hear what you've been working on.
Thank you. And then I see Dr. Tolentino.
Hi, good afternoon. Sorry, my camera is off.
No problem.
It's been a very interesting morning. So, but yeah, I'm an assistant professor at the School of Nursing. My research is on Filipino Americans with type 2 diabetes. But food plays a powerful role in, shaping culture and identity, and really serving as a means of connection, tradition, and pride, especially in the Filipino American community. So I see food as an intersection with colonial mentality or internalized racism, as colonial influences have really historically stigmatized Filipino ingredients and cooking practices. And so that's some sort of things that I'm looking in my research as well. So I'm looking forward to your talk this afternoon.
Thank you. And then Farnaz.
Hi, this is Farnaz, Director of Student Services.
And then I think we've had one. I think you already introduced yourself, but so we're good. Oh, and then Dr. Robbins.
Hello, yes, I'm Dr. Robbins, and I'm really interested in attending today because you're one of our up and coming, very strong assistant professors, and I am excited to hear your about your research. Also, I, looked at environmental and workplace toxicants and male fertility for years. And finally, it dawned on me that, well, maybe, we should do a little health promotion here, and was funded by walnut growers in California to look at walnuts and if they had any effect on fertility, because the science is there to back that up. And indeed, it turned out that yes, we did a study and generated evidence. So I'm a firm believer in diet and all aspects of health, including fertility, male fertility.
That's very interesting. Yeah, it's amazing. I think in the last decade, there has been a whole kind of like realization about the importance of not just the foods we eat, but how they're processed, how they are, where they come from, how, all those different pieces and things like fertilizers, like how does that affect us? Does it affect us? And these competing bad diets we now see because of social media, right? We have, it's keto, it's intermittent fasting, like all of these different things, but what do they really mean? And especially to like Anthony was mentioning about also how does culture and identity fall into this? So thank you for coming. I'm really looking forward to sharing with you a little bit about what I've been working on. So before I kind of do that, I wanted to share a little bit of background about me. So I think Juan gave a wonderful introduction to who I am. I think professionally, but I also in these types of presentations, I like to also tell you a little bit more about myself. So I am a Mexican woman. I was that picture on the picture on the left, depending on how you look at it. That is Toluca. That's my hometown. It's a city that's 9,000 feet above sea level near Mexico City. So that is, so it was built in the skirts of a kind of dormant volcano. And so that is also a huge part of my identity and kind of what I grew up with. I think the other big piece is that I grew up in a farm. So, like I was there with my family, we were milking the cows, we were, getting the corn and kind of like saw food production in a very different way. And kind of my love for food really developed very early on from living in a farm and seeing how that food was grown and produced. And then I remember when I moved to this country, I was maybe about 9 years old. And I came, from getting my eggs from the farm and my corn and my veggies from the farm to like, oh, now I'm in California and I'm buying things in the grocery store and they don't taste the same. And I'm trying to make the same recipes that I had growing up. And I didn't always have the ingredients. And then I kind of really quickly realized that, like Anthony was saying, there's this perception of what's healthy and what's not. And often this idea that Mexican food is not healthy, which is a complete misunderstanding of Mexican food that is sold in fast food places and Mexican influenced food sold in fast places is very different than the kind of foods that I grew up with, where meat, for example, when I was growing up, meat was really expensive. It was something that the upper class and the upper middle class had access to, but lower class did not always have access to meats. It was almost like a luxury. So for us, like things like eggs, things like we ate like nopales, like the cactus, the pumpkin flowers, all these different vegetables. Oh, verdolagas, which is like a weed that grows wildly. Here I think it's actually one of those weeds people pull out of your backyards, and I always see them and I'm like, that's verdolaga, that's edible. You make amazing food with it. And all of those foods are incredibly rich in nutrients, but that's not what people think of when they hear Mexican food. And so kind of reclaiming and reshaping that narrative about what healthy means, and what food is healthy and what food is not, I think it's really important, because I think in every single culture, there's both healthy foods and unhealthy foods. And we can't just assume all, like every Mexican food is unhealthy, like all the what, no, I think it's, it's important to kind of recognize that. And I think as Juan kind of talked about at the beginning, my first degree is actually in neuroscience. And I was really interested in neurobiology, physiology, and behavior. And a lot of that had to do with like behavior and the underlying neural mechanisms that influence our behavior. And kind of understanding then that we have these other like predispositions and physiological processes that affect people's behavior, whether they in a way that is also important to know, right? So we have people who have, just like how for a long time, there was a huge taboo around alcoholism and like, kind of people seeing it as, some sort of, very quickly we realized there is genetic predisposition to it. There is, risk factors, there's all of these different things. And so it's important to understand that it's not just, people have to be strong and do this, but it's, people have predispositions and there's things in their environment that affects their predisposition and the risk for developing conditions like obesity. And so from there, I kind of started in my my dissertation. I really focused on looking at the effects of chemotherapy on eating behavior and what we could do to reduce nausea and vomiting to help people undergoing chemo. And then kind of from there in my postdoc did the opposite end of the spectrum. Well, these are the things that kind of help. What are some of the things that make it challenging for people living with overweight and obesity? And I mean, personally, in my family, everybody has overweight, obesity, and diabetes. Like everybody does. And so I obviously carry a huge genetic predisposition, and I try to still very physically active, but I'm not gonna always, beat those genetic predispositions. I've run marathons, I've run half marathons. I just ran a race a couple weeks ago with my son, like pushing him on the stroller. Like I try to be physically active, but there's things, that we can't help. And so my research then focuses precisely on that. So there's a piece about eating behavior, and so the main focus is this eating behavior in the context of health. And I think another important thing to understand is that when I say eating behavior, I don't necessarily mean eating disorders, because I think that's slightly different. And sometimes when people hear eating behaviors, they assume eating disorders. And I think eating disorders are a subsection of that, but not the only the only thing. And so when I look at eating behavior, I'm looking at it in the context of obesity and metabolic health, which includes anything like cardiovascular disease, diabetes, all of these different things that are influenced by cardiometabolic health. And of course, when I say behavior, it's also looking at, culture, beliefs, perception, but also the environment that also has an impact on our behavior, right? If we live in the food desert and that's all we have access to, that's going to impact what we eat. And then of course the physiological piece, which are those underlying mechanisms, including genetics, but also including pathophysiological processes and mental health that ultimately have an effect on this concept of energy balance, which I'm going to talk a little bit about in the next slide. So when I say energy balance, I mean that kind of, I think you get this a lot in nursing school, probably have heard of it at some point or another, of kind of like this seesaw of trying to balance the energy that you spend during the day with the energy that you take in. So that being food and anything that you eat or drink, versus the energy that you put out there. And the ideal thing is that you keep this perfect balance so that you maintain a healthy weight. Now, obviously in obesity, that scale is tipped so that the intake is kind of is greater than the energy that's being spent. But like I said, that doesn't necessarily mean that physiologically people might not have a perfect energy balance and still be slim, just like people might, the other way around. So like you could have somebody that's really, really skinny, but their energy expenditure might be higher because their metabolism is higher, right? And so then their scale is going to tip, and it's going to stay balanced. Whereas for somebody who, is maybe overeating, it could tip the scale, but also if your metabolism is really slow, if there's other genetic and pathophysiological processes going on, you might not be able to use that energy in the same way, right? So, and and what's really cool is a lot of this idea of energy expenditure, it involves everything from, the GI system to your brain. And there's a lot of kind of back and forth, and I'm not going to go through all the little details of this energy and a little balance diagram, but I think the main idea is just that it is energy intake versus energy expenditure, or the energy that we use up during the day. But there's many factors that could affect that, and that could be your metabolism, which can vary from people. It varies with age. It varies with sex. It varies with genetic predisposition. And also, but also, intake too. you know, if you live maybe in a food desert and all you have access to is fast food, which are very energy dense foods, your intake might be a lot higher than, you know, somebody who perhaps has more access to healthier foods and the means to pay for them. You know, so I kind of, my big thing that I always talk about is there's this idea of like blaming, or like, I think a lot of people with overweight and obesity struggle with this idea. It almost feels like there's a lot of shame and blame associated with it. And it's really important to understand that there are physiological differences between people that could account for that. And so it's important that we keep all of those things in mind and don't blame or shame our patients. And I think it's important that we work with them and also have culturally sensitive support, right? So maybe it's not telling people to not eat tortillas, but you know, a corn tortilla is very different than a flour tortilla, right? So like, how do we do this in a way that's still increasing health, but in a way that's more culturally sensitive? And so I'm going to so that's a little bit about the background of what I'm studying. So again, kind of just focusing on that, those three pieces of behavior, in behavior, but also the underlying mechanisms. And so I'll talk very quickly about some of the projects that I'm working on. We're about to submit this one. But for example, in this particular study, what we did is, and I had recently published a study that was similar to this. So this might look similar to something I published recently, to those that are maybe familiar with my research, but this is slightly different because here what we did is we compared low fat versus low carb diets. So this idea of like a ketogenic diet would be a low carb diet, right? And then the low fat diet would be the other way. So the low fat diet might include things like carbohydrates and grains, whereas the low carb diet is a lot of like animal based in this particular diet that we followed. But it could be higher in fat. So like the ketogenic diet. And so we kind of looked at that. We had a group of participants, that's 18 people, and kind of follow these diets over time across 4 weeks and kind of looked at how that affected their intake of different nutrients. And so the parent study to this, you know, was published, and they both diets resulted or led to some decrease in weight. But what was interesting is that one of them, I think the low fat diet had decreased in things like triglycerides, right? Which would make sense because it's lower in fat. But you know, then you have to also pay attention to how people gain the weight back. And so, you know, it was a good way of understanding. But for my particular piece, I was really interested in seeing too how taste changed in response to these diets, because a huge driver of what we choose to eat is our taste. How do we, you know, does food taste good? How do we perceive it? And how does it change over time when you're exposed to different foods? So that's one of the things that we looked at. And so people's like ability to taste sodium and sugar following the different diets. And so first we looked at their intake and how it differed by the two diets. So I think in a way it's kind of intuitive that people who were taking the low carb diet had higher, let's see where the low carb diet, let's go to the sucrose. I think the sucrose is kind of self-explanatory. So because you're eating carbs, your sucrose intake is like a little bit higher, right? Than if you were just eating things higher in fat. But then, for example, when you switch around and look at the salt, you're eating things that have less sugar, but then they're eating, you kind of see the opposite. You're eating more salt. So you can really see those differences over time. And you know, what does that mean for our bodies? And that's important to understand. Ooh, I don't know why. Sorry about that. I don't know why it looks like that. This was just kind of showing the exact numbers, but we found that there were differences in salt preference between the group, the low carb and low fat diet. So after a certain amount of time, the people on the low carb diet, so they were eating more fats, kind of had higher preference for salt, right? It makes sense. And again, so that's important to know if you're doing, cardiomedical, like if it's somebody with cardiovascular disease, right? So it's like, yes, some things might help you lose weight, but what does that do overall? And they both seem to help lose weight, which is important because that lowers your risk of a lot of different things, but then we have to think how it changes other things. And so something else, this is a project that I'm currently working on. So I'm working with a researcher in the School of Nursing who's leading a project looking at discrimination and stress and how that influences the brain gut, but looking specifically among Filipino and Mexican women. And so for my little piece, I'm just looking, I kind of took a sample of the larger study to conduct interviews. And we wanted to characterize these ideas of social isolation and discrimination as stressors from the perspective of Mexican American women to really understand what does it mean for them. And also kind of any perceptions related to eating behavior, obesity, and health. And then the idea is that hopefully we can develop some sort of intervention to better support Mexican American women specifically. And then based on that, kind of follow up with a focus group that can allow us to then talk about this. And, as far as platforms, it would be some sort of, the ultimate goal is to have some social media platform or app that we can kind of incorporate to support women. And so that's kind of where we are. That being said, I'm going to shamelessly try to recruit at the end of the presentation. I think we need a few more Mexican American women to finish up with the interviews. And so if you're interested, I'll show you the flyer for that at the end. And then I'm looking at, I'm doing quite a bit of other studies, including using a large data set where I wanted to look at the effects of acculturation on body composition, specifically then looking at language as a proxy for acculturation. That's often done. I'm not sure. I am also looking at different measures of acculturation just to see how that compares to using language. But yeah, that's something that would be interesting. My hypothesis was that being bilingual might be protective because it has been shown to have an effect on executive function. And so things like bilingualism being protective, but the data is interesting so far. So I don't know. I'm still working on this. It's a little bit different than what I expected, but working on this project. And then I have a few other projects that are related. I'm looking at the idea of, I am doing one on zinc, but I'm also just looking at salt and cardiovascular disease in large data sets of large US data sets and seeing, how that differs between people with cardiovascular disease and those without. And I'm doing a review as well, where we're looking at obesity in Latinas and different interventions that have been used. So we actually decided to do a systematic review, so I should update this slide. And we did our search, and right now we're just in the process of looking through all the studies, and it's been really, really interesting. And then I guess just in general, I had this So I did a presentation or this particular slide about just like what research is to early to nursing students early on in their careers. So you might already know this, but so here are some, you know, I kind of just talked about the different types of research and kind of what a systematic review is, because that is something that we had been working on, or that's one of the projects that I'm working on. And yeah, so thank you so much for being here. And that being said, I'm also looking for students to be part of the lab. So if you're ever interested in gaining research experience, it depends. I think if you're undergraduate students, it's a little bit easier. For graduate students, it's a little bit trickier. But, you know, it's at least something that can be, you know, reach out to your faculty, whether it's me or somebody else who might be whose research you might be interested in, and see what's out there. There's a lot of different opportunities if you're interested in research. There's different types of research scholarships. This usually opens up in May, closes in June. So just keep that in mind. There's summer opportunities. There's also opportunities to do SRP 99s. So kind of these independent studies working with your faculty. That's some other options. And I usually just share this because I think it's important that you know a lot of them, you know, even as a nursing student, that there's other things you can do. And knowing that research is something you can do as a nurse, and that you're particularly well positioned to do research because you've been at the bedside, you've seen a lot of these issues unfold, and you have a unique lens and perspective to contribute that perhaps, you know, our physician colleagues might not have the same experience. So I think every voice needs to be represented in research, and every point of view needs to be represented in research, because it has been shown that diversity in research leads to better research. So with that, I just want to encourage you to think about those things. And if you have any questions either about research or becoming involved, I'm, you know, very happy to talk to students. And then let me just share my slides. I'll tell you a little bit about I'm shamelessly also going to share about the study that I'm currently working on. So please, if you could support me, if you're interested, it's something, you know, you could share with your friends or family members, or if you're interested yourself, feel free to reach out to me directly in an email, and I'll get you in touch with whoever you need to do, so it's not an extra burden. But we are still recruiting Mexican American women. And it involves 2 in-person visits. So if you're already on campus, you know, a couple times a week or whenever it is, it's quite convenient. And I think, you know, we think it's very important to compensate people for their time and effort in participating in our research. So participants can earn up to $675 for participating in this study. And then after participating in that biology piece, they can participate in the interviews that I'm conducting. And that's, I think, an additional 50%, $50 compensation for your time, because we do really value and treasure the time that you're able to share with us. So what's really cool about this study too, it's one of the first studies that uses, so the study looks at Mexican women and Filipino women. And it's one of the few studies that's not using like Caucasian or white as a control. We think it's very important that we start looking at minorities without comparing them to white as the control or as the, the standard. So I think it's really important that this study was able to do that. And so we're looking at 2 groups of minority women. And we think that's very important to do so that research stops just assuming that a certain group is the standard that everybody should compare to. So it's very important for us, and we're really excited. If anybody's interested or has family members that are interested and qualify, you're welcome to reach out to me. I'm gonna share my email in the chat, so you're welcome to contact me directly. So that's my email, and for those of you that are here, I'm more than happy to talk to you directly or share my information. But yeah, and if you're also interested in just careers as a nurse researcher, my door is always open. As kind of like a newer researcher, I'm always happy to share my journey.
Thank you, Dr. Jaime-Lara. Round of applause, everybody. Thank you. That was wonderful. So at this time, we're gonna go ahead and take questions either in the room or here on Zoom. Those of you on Zoom, feel free to drop your questions in the chat. We'll go over them. Any questions? Yes, Dr. Robbins.
Yes, I do have a question since we have an expert here. I want to ask this. So for years we've been measuring BMI, right? And then it went to waist-hip ratio, right? And now it's something called body roundness. So what's your view on these three measures? What should we be measuring?
I think that's an excellent question. I also think it varies by age group. So for example, for children, I think what they've been using is the BMI-C. So that's kind of adjusted for, age, puberty status, all of these different things. So it's really hard in children and adolescents because taking into account all those factors, sex and puberty status. So that makes it really hard. Yeah, and I think the majority, a lot of the literature had kind of looked at perhaps, for example, in adults, the waist circumference is something being because it's also how the fat is distributed. So I think what you're mentioning right now is that we realized that a lot of it is not just, the how much weight, or because BMI, all it measures is weight and height. And it doesn't take into account, I have my issues with BMI because it doesn't take into account age, it doesn't take into account sex. Well, it does to a certain extent, but the standards that were built about BMI, again, were kind of built looking at white males. And so it's, it's a little bit interesting. And then it doesn't account for muscle mass. So for a lot of people who perhaps are like bodybuilders, they might be really heavy and they might appear obese in BMI, but they're actually perfectly healthy. So yeah, I think there's kind of like a healthy realization and conversation about how best define health and measure that. So this idea of moving away. That being said, it's very difficult to, for example, measure the amount of, you can do a DEXA scan and look at fat percentage and do all of these different things. But of course, that's a lot harder to do. So it's understandable why we kind of use things like BMI when that's what we have based or most available and it's least invasive. But understanding, I think, of the limitations of each of those ways of measuring. I think the important part is understanding the limitations, and whatever it is that you use is to keep that in mind, understand.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Robbins, for that great question. Any other questions? We see something in the chat from Elizabeth. Somewhat related question. Do you have any thoughts on the health at every size framework like the APRN? I also worked at an FQHC for years and saw many patients with obesity. A lot of our doctors offered counseling, but I couldn't help but notice that a lot of the counseling was about problems that the patients actually didn't have. For instance, my patient had normal blood pressure and cholesterol, but providers sometimes made assumptions about those factors based on body size.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent point. And I'd like to repeat again that just because somebody might be lean, for example, doesn't mean they're necessarily cardiovascularly healthy. So just like you see in one, you see kind of like the opposite. And although you have higher risk of cardiometabolic disease and a lot of things if you're overweight and obese, that doesn't necessarily mean, and as providers, we really should keep that in mind when we work with patients that, yeah, just because somebody might look overweight, that doesn't mean they're not, I don't know, for example, maybe they just ran a marathon, which would like happen to me. I just ran a half marathon and like, I remember walking to the doctor one day and I had run a half marathon the previous weekend. They're like, oh, well, you're a little overweight. How let's talk about increasing your physical activity. How about you do 20-minute walks every day? And I was like, I just ran a half marathon in like less than 2 hours. And you're talking to me about like walking 20 minutes. Like, so I think it's really important that we that I think as providers, we need to be very mindful of stereotypes and assumptions that we make when we're working with people. And instead of imposing our views of what is going on, always ask, right? How different would it have been if somebody had asked me, so what are you currently doing for physical activity, right? So, I think as providers, especially nurses in the room, it's really important that we ask instead of assume.
Great, thank you for that. Any other questions or comments? I do have a question, Dr. Jaime-Lara. So you mentioned something about studies have found that people who speak two languages or more, and then there was something about like a direct impact on the person's health in a positive way. Did I read that right?
No, so there's it's one of those things that we're just starting to better understand. So, but there does seem to be some cognitive benefits to bilingualism in executive function and in different yeah. So all of those things. For example, people who are bilingual, it has been shown, I'm not an expert in dementia but it's good kind of like for brain health. So it is protective. From dementia and other things related to brain health. So yeah, I mean, it's something, that we're kind of learning slowly about. It's kind of like a big topic right now that people are looking at. Yeah.
Any other questions? How about anybody in the room? No questions in the room? I guess I have another question. Dr. Jaime-Lara, so far in your research and work, have you come across any results or findings that you were not expecting to find?
Yeah, interesting. Like, so for example, having talked to a lot of women throughout my interviews, it was very interesting to see how people perceived discrimination, for example. A lot of people, most people had reported like maybe not perceiving discrimination, but then they would I'd see stories about discrimination described. So it's really interesting. There seemed to be like a kind of like a disconnect somewhere along the way about what discriminations look like versus how it was defined. So yeah, I thought that was really interesting, and I think there could be many things. It could be not wanting to be perceived as being victimized, kind of wanting to feel empowered, and then therefore not letting something like that define their experience. Oh yeah, that's kind of like something that I've kind of encountered and um yeah.
Any other questions or comments? Okay, it's okay with you, Dr. Lara. We're gonna go ahead and wrap it up. Please round of applause for Dr. Jaime-Lara. Yay!
Thanks
Awesome.
for having me.
Thank you so much, Dr. Rosario Jaime-Lara, for today. This was really great. Yes, and join us back again in the winter quarter when the Faculty Spotlight program returns. Bye, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you.